Hello and welcome back. This is Jennifer and I'm thankful you're here. Today I thought I'd show you a way to get more from your layering dies, and that is to use them as stencils. Keep in mind, however, you can actually use this technique with regular dies too. Layering dies are really fun for creating dimension on your cards, but they do have a higher price point due to all the dies included. So I think it's best to try to find more ways to use them to get that value from them. So today we're using those layering dies to create stencils, and it's amazing how well this works. I have a couple examples for you, and I hope that this will encourage you to try this technique to get more from your stash. Let's first create this card, and then we'll use the same dies to create a stenciled card. I think it's best to start with just die cutting as it was intended, so we can kind of plan out the stenciling. This is the new Altenew Lovely Daisies die set. I really like this one because of the playful style it has, and that it's very easy to layer. I'll start by die cutting all the pieces. For some of the layers, I'll use my Altenew adhesive sheets to put adhesive on the back of the cardstock before I die cut. This allows me to turn my die cuts into stickers so they're easy to layer. Now, you don't have to do this, but if you have a lot of layering to do or you have intricate die cuts, I do recommend it. So here I have some colored cardstock with the adhesive already in the back. And I'm taking the 3 layering dies for the flowers that's included in the set, taping it on there and running it through my die cut machine. The die easily cuts through the cardstock and the adhesive on the back. So now these are like stickers, which makes it easy to assemble. I did a bunch of die cutting off screen so I could create a bunch of flowers for this card and also for future cards. I'm able to easily peel off the release paper from the back of this die cut and just stick it right in place on its layer. And then I just use a bone folder to really press it down. The adhesive bonds as soon as you press it down, so it gives you a little bit of time to move it around until you do that actual pressing. I also did the little center pieces so that I could have these bold, colorful flowers. I will admit I did double layering. So I did 2 cardstock layers of each so that it really would stand out on the final card. Off screen, I assembled a bunch of flowers and stems, just following the guide that comes with the die set from Altenew, but it's really easy to figure out. Now let's do the white background. Notice there's a plaid textured pattern there. I did this using the Altenew Basic Plaid Embossing folder. I'm putting a piece of 110-pound white cardstock into this. Any cardstock should work. And then I'm running it through my die cut machine. For a Spellbinders, a platinum machine, you just put the embossing folder on your platform, 1 cutting plate on top, and that does the trick. You should be able to use this embossing folder with whatever die cut machine you have. And look at this beautiful texture. You could use either side on your project. I've cut a piece of double-sided adhesive from Altenew to be a little bit smaller than 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, and I'm putting that on the front of a white note card. I then will add our textured embossing folder piece that we just created on top of that. By using the double-sided adhesive sheet, I can be sure that this piece will stick to the front of our note card, even though it has all of that texture. So again, this will end up being 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inches. And I'll use my bone folder to just press that down and make sure it's completely adhered. I really believe one of the best ways to make your card stand out is to use an embossing folder or some sort of detail background die on your cards before adding anything on top. It just really adds a lot of interest. Okay, so I have assembled some flowers here on the front of my card, just kind of planning out where they'll go, along with the sentiment that I'll show you later. When I'm kind of happy with where everything is, I'll just take a quick picture with my camera and I'll save this. Now I can refer to this as I start gluing the pieces down. So I have my different pieces. Again, these are just layered with different colors of cardstock, 2 thick of each layer. I put liquid adhesive on the back and then add it to my card front. I'm using Gina Connect liquid adhesive. I find this a nice strong liquid adhesive. And I'm also adding my sentiment on top, which I stamped and die cut. Again, I'll show you that in a moment. I wanted to add a little bit of sparkle, so I have my Trinity stamps, clear crystal gems, and I'm adding a few to each of the flowers and to the background. Notice there I dropped my tool and made the little gems fly everywhere. It happens to all of us. So here is the completed card. It has lots of fun texture to it and bright colors. The best part about this is I have a completed card, but I also can use this as a guide for my next card, where I use the same dies as stencils to create a more one-layer card. It's a great way to stretch those dies and get more value from them, but I tell you, I love the texture that this one has to offer. By the way, that sentiment that says "You color my world" is from this Altenew Colorful Souls stamp set. Now you'll notice I've already cut a bunch of die cuts using the coordinating dies from this stamp set because I plan to make a bunch of cards with it. This stamp set creates these beautiful, unique flowers, very easy to layer. It has a fun artsy look to it, and there are lots of great sentiments. I just use a sentiment today, but look forward to a future video where I use the floral stamps to create layered flowers. Okay, now let's take those same dies from before and the same design, but create a card that is done with stenciling, so there's a lot less dimension to it. To create my own stencils, I'm using heavyweight vellum. I like to use heavyweight vellum because it die cuts easily and you can see through it to make sure you get your stencil just where you want it. But you could also use a heavyweight cardstock, or you could use acetate if it die cuts easily. I'm die cutting all the different layering dies included in that layering floral die cut set. By the way, another thing you can use to create your own stencils is this leftover release paper from double-sided adhesive sheets. That also works well. You could also just use cardstock scraps, but that makes it a little more challenging to make sure you get your stencil exactly where you want it. So I have all of my little vellum stencils here ready to go, all created from one of the layering flowers. So let's get started doing stenciling in a background that is similar to the one that I've already created with the die cuts. So I start by putting together some of the stencils that I've created. Here I'm putting the centerpiece into the stencil so that I just have the dots. We'll need that one later on. That will create the little dots of brown in the center of the flower. So you might have different pieces that you have to put together to create the different layers. For example, here we also have the large first layer of the flower, where I need to tape the center of the flower in, so we just have the petals on our stencil. So I'm putting that stencil onto our white cardstock background, and again, I'm following the guide that I have over there on the right that's already completed. I chose to use Altenew Crisp Dye Inks today and an Altenew blending brush, but you could use whatever ink or brush you prefer. Now, I do recommend putting the ink on lightly and carefully. This isn't a true stencil that's pretty durable. This is vellum, and there are intricate parts that I don't want to mess up or fold or damage in any way. So by putting the ink on light, I can be sure that I don't mess that up. And I just kind of build up that light, soft layer of color gently until I'm happy with the results. I then can remove that stencil and move on to the next layering stencil that we made with our layering dies. Now I'm using a slightly darker color of the same one, so it's just a darker pink, and applying it to that opening. You could use the same shade of pink if you want, and just put on a heavier amount. Now I'm moving to the top of the flower, the middle of the flower there, applying some pumpkin pie ink. Now we have the stencil where we tape those two pieces together, and I'm using a smaller blending brush with some paper bag brown ink for the little dots in the center. You can always wipe your stencil that you made out of vellum clean with a dry cloth or a baby wipe. Now I'm moving on to the stencils that I made with the stem dies in the set. One of the nice things about making your own stencils from your dies is that you could use either side, so you can create a mirror image also. Here you can see I'm doing the two layers of the stem very easily. So this is a great way to get more out of your dies, to use them as stencils. Next, I'll move on to another flower and apply different colors of ink. So this shows you can use any dies really for this. I find it really fun with layering dies like the one I'm using here. But if you just have a solid, maybe mandala die or a floral die that's just one die, you can also turn that into a stencil and maybe apply different colors over the opening. As I mentioned, you can flip it over and get a mirror image too, which opens a door for lots of different designs or techniques. I continued to create other flowers on this background just like I showed you with the pink one at the bottom. I covered up most of the background with our floral images and stems, but I stopped when I got towards that middle right area where I want to put a sentiment. I'll then stamp that sentiment and continue to add more flowers around it. Since I have a background I really like and I don't want to mess it up at this point, I'm using my Tailored Expressions alignment panels to make sure I get the stamp sentiment exactly where I want it. This is a clear grid panel that's nice and thick, and you put it right over your background or card. Then you can line up any stamp you want on top of it without worries of messing up your cardstock underneath. So I used the grid to make sure I got my sentiment straight. You can even practice stamping on that clear grid if you want to. But I'm happy with my placement, so I'm inking it up and stamping it with black ink. That grid is really helpful if you tend to mess up a lot like I do. Once I have that sentiment in place, I can add some more flowers around it, covering up the entire background. I also broke out the older Altenew Bold Bunch stamp set. I love this one. I've used it before. I'll link to the video in the top right. I'm taking some of the small flowers from this and stamping it with a light yellow ink in some of the gaps in the background, just to kind of fill it in. This is the Altenew Buttercream color, which is just a beautiful soft yellow. I'm going to double or triple stamp that just to make it a bit darker. I like having the option of keeping it light or making it a bit darker, just by stamping it multiple times. After I stamp yellow flowers to fill in the gaps, I'm taking the 3 little dot image from the same stamp set and stamping that with the Paper Bag Brown ink at the center, also just to add some color into those open gaps. And finally, I took my YR27 Copic marker, you could use any marker, just to add some even darker brown to some of the dots at the center of the flowers, just to give a little bit of contrast. Although I used bright colors of inks, I didn't put much of the ink down, so it has more of a muted feel to it. This makes it stand out. Now I trimmed that panel down and added it to a 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch black note card, and then I added a white panel on the inside to write my personal message. I again added some clear gemstones to the center of the flowers and to the background just so there's a little bit of sparkle to it. But you could totally skip that and keep this a 1-layer card if you prefer. So you can see here how I used the same dies and the same design of the last card, but I was able to use them to create a stenciled look. It's a wonderful way to get more out of your supplies. Let's do another set of examples. First, I'm doing one card that has a bunch of layering die cuts on it. Then I'll do a second card that's a little simpler using the layering dies, and then a third card where I use the layering dies as stencils. So we're going to get a lot out of this one die set. This is the new Altenew Gold Band Lily Layering Die Set. Very easy to line up, and I like that the packaging comes with a guide so you have that as reference as you're creating. So I did a bunch of die cutting off screen. I first was going to make my base layer a bright peach, but I ended up changing my mind. But do know I did a bunch of die cutting with off-white, yellow, a little bit darker yellow, and green cardstocks. Because I'm experimenting with the colors with the actual die cuts, it'll make coming up with the colors I need for the stenciled card much easier. I ended up making the base of my lily a light yellow cardstock. And then the second layer, this one here with the little holes in it, I did out of an ivory cardstock. I'm putting glue on the back of this and I'll glue it onto that first light yellow base. Now there are those little holes that I wanted like a bright pink to show through. I Googled this type of flower and I noticed the little dots are kind of like a pinkish purple. So I want to add that color. So I glued this first one down, and to add color to those dots, I'm going to scribble over this die cut, over all the hole openings, with a purplish color marker. You can use any marker. I'm using a Copic marker because that's what I have on hand. It doesn't matter how messy this is because we'll glue another die cut of the exact same on top. That way, the purple color will show through the openings. This is just a really fast way of making the colors just how you want it. I could have done purple cardstock for that light yellow base, but if you look closely, the light yellow base sticks out the edges too, and I didn't want that to be purple. So this was the easiest way to achieve the colors I wanted. The next layer I did in a brighter yellow, and then we just have the centerpiece that I did with green and dark brown. This is very easy to layer up, and you could do this in all different colors, but I really liked this light yellow version. I was so happy with it that I made 3 of these flowers. 2 of them will go on one card, and then the third one will go on a separate card. Okay, let's make this card where I put lots of lily die cuts on it. I just thought they were beautiful, and this would be a fun design. So I'm using the new Altenew Nesting Slim Label die set. These are great because they work on cards all the way up to a full slimline. They also work great on mini slimline and smaller. I'll be doing a mini slimline card today. The overall card size will be 6 1/4 by 3.5 inches. These dies also make a little impression inside of the cutting edge, which gives a nice finish. Okay, this is the Altenew Simply the Best stamp set. This is an older one I use often for the sentiments, and I stamped a sentiment on the bottom of one of the white label die cuts with black ink. I also have a cream colored note card there, or ivory colored note card, and again that is 6 1/4 by 3.5. I did stamp that with a stripe stamp set, which I'll show you in a moment, and I stamped that with a very light yellow ink. It's almost hard to see in the video, but it does add a little something extra to the background. I just glued this panel on and trimmed the excess off the top. I wanted this to be kind of set up to the top of the card. Now I have my lilies, and I also created some leaf pieces from the same die set using green cardstock, and I'm just figuring out how best to arrange these. Once I'm happy with arrangement, I just glued them down, and then I added some gold gemstones around it. I have a mini slimline envelope that's craft color, which I think looks nice with the soft yellow card that we made. So when you look closely, you'll see the stamping on the background of the note card. I'll show you that stamp set in a moment. But I really wanted this card to be all about those layered die cuts. I think layered die cuts are beautiful. You can make these in any colors you want. And I'll show you how to get more from these layering dies in a couple cards from now when I show you how to do the stenciling. We still have a leftover lily, so let's create this second card. And this will be a guide for our stenciled card, which we'll do next. Now this doesn't open like a traditional card. It has a flap that lifts open to reveal a personal message underneath. To create that flap, I'm using one of the label die cuts. I showed you the dies earlier. And I'll put a score line over on the side. I have a card panel front here that is slightly smaller than 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches. And I'm using that as kind of a guide on where I want to score this label die. I actually have 2 backgrounds and 2 label dies I'll be scoring so that I can make one card with the layered die cut and a similar card with the layered dies used as stencils. So I'm doing 2 at once here, which is a huge time saver. You can do this flap card design with any large die cut shape. You could use even a cut rectangle if you want. Now I did stamp those ivory card panels with a light yellow ink using this woven stripes background stamp. This is what I used on the last card also. I've been using this a lot lately. It's great because it also is big enough to cover a mini slimline card, as I did with my last card. So let's assemble our cards. I have my stamped ivory panel here, again, a little bit smaller than an A2 card, and I'm putting adhesive on the small flap of our label die cut. I'll glue that to the back of our ivory panel, and there you have the flap that will be on the front of our card. I will then glue this onto a white panel that is 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches. Again, this will not open like a typical card. The only opening is that large flap on the front. So I would know where to write my personal message. I created another die cut and I cut off the left side of it, and I'm gluing this underneath the flap, making sure that it lines up. You could skip this if you want to, but I feel like it gives it a nice finished look and you know where to put your personal greeting. On the front of the flap, I added our lily die cut that we created earlier and also tucked some leaves underneath it. Now for a sentiment, I'm using an older project kit from Altenew. This is their first Craft Your Life project kit. It's called Seasonal Blooms. It's one of my favorites. I love this. It comes with a 6x8 stamp set, layering stencils, and all the dies that you see here. What I really like is that this includes hello and thanks dies along with the shadows for them. And the shadows also line up with the hello and thanks stamp in the stamp set. I did a video showing lots that you can do with this particular card kit, and I'll link it up here on the top right. Today, all I'm using is the thanks dies and the thanks stamp on the next card. Off screen, I used the thanks word die to cut from white cardstock and gold cardstock that already has Altenew double-sided adhesive on the back. Remember me showing you how to do that at the beginning of this video? Well, that makes it easy to glue these intricate die cuts together. So I'm gluing a gold thanks die cut on top of a white thanks die cut. Since it already has the adhesive on the back of it, it's very easy to line up. It's hard to see, but I'm actually putting that on top of a white die cut that's still in the negative space. That's also helpful for lining up these delicate die cuts. Once I'm happy with how they're lined up, I can just press them together with my bone folder. Then I can peel that off, that layered die cut, and add it to my card anywhere I want. I did decide to, instead of sticking it to my card, add it onto the shadow die cut that's included in the die set. I cut that from white cardstock, so I'll just stick that on, press it down with a bone folder, and then add that onto our card. By adding this word onto its shadow, it makes it stand out even more. After gluing the thanks die cut down, I added some gold gemstones around the flower just for a little bit of shine. You can see how the card flap opens up to reveal your personal greeting underneath. It's fun to do something different other than just a typical folded card. Here you can see all the layering of that die cut. Man, I love that layering, but keep in mind you could do less layers. I doubled up a lot of cardstock and I used a little bit of foam tape. You could always make it less dimensional if you want to. I love all the dimension this has to offer. Okay, now let's do the stenciled version of that card. Same card design, but we're going to change it up and use our dies as stencils. Remember, you can create one layer cards with this technique. Okay, so I have my little die cut panel here that will get glued onto the flap when we're done. I have already used those lily dies to cut from vellum to create our own stencils. I'm starting with the most solid one and applying a light yellow ink. This is the sun-kissed color. Again, I go very light-handed so I don't damage our stencil. Also, that way I can control how much ink goes down. I can keep it really light if I want a softer looking flower, or apply even more if I want it to be more intense. Now we're going to the next layer and applying a little bit of ink over this. This layer isn't much different from the first one, so I'm not going to add a whole lot. Now remember, this second layer had little holes in the die cut, so I'm going to tape that back in. I'm going to tape that in so now I can use this as a stencil to create those little dots. So you can mix and match your pieces together and get just what you want to create your layered flower. So now I'll line that up with our inking we've already done, and I'll apply like a pink ink over this. You could really make these any colors you want. I'm just following what I Googled off the internet. Whenever I struggle with how to color a critter or an image, that's my favorite go-to. I Google the name of it, and then I click the images button, and lots of realistic images come up, and I can just follow that as a guide. Okay, now we can move on to the next layer. This time I'll move to a little bit darker yellow. This is pumpkin pie, and I'll use a smaller blending brush here. I do find it helpful to use smaller blending brushes when you get into smaller areas like this, but if you only have a large blending brush, that will work great also. Next we have the center of the flower, and I'll do this in a green color. I believe I used the frayed leaf color. And I'm doing this lightly until I'm happy with the color, and then you can add more if you want to. I did decide to add a darker green kind of towards the base of that stencil opening just to give it a little look of dimension. Now for the tops of this, instead of using the stencil, I just used a brown marker. I just felt like that would be much easier to do. And this is just an E44 marker or E57. You could use whatever you have on hand. Now this next step is totally optional, but I decided to use some markers to add a little bit of darker color towards the center there, again, just to add to that look of dimension. So you can always bring in a little bit of shading with your markers. I'm not good at coloring, and even I can do this. Sometimes just a little bit makes a big difference. Now we need to add the leaves around it, but I want to mask off the flower first. That's easy to do because remember how we created our vellum stencil from that first layer of the flower? Well, I'm just taking the positive piece of that, taping it over our flower to protect it. Now I'm doing our leaf stencil right on top of that and applying green ink on it. So my flower is protected by the mask that we created earlier from the vellum. So I can just move my little leaf stencils around and add as many leaves as I want, and it'll look like it's coming out from behind the flower. I continued to do this to add lots of leaves, and I used the layers of the leaf dyes to create my layered stencils, and I added light, medium, and dark green to those. I feel like adding all those layers of ink really makes it look even more realistic. After I completed all of my stenciling, I can remove the mask, and there we have our very smooth flower that we created from those layering dyes. Okay, so now we can just assemble our card. I needed a little sentiment to go under the word thanks for this one, so I grabbed the Altenew Bird of the Woods stamp set, one of my favorites, and on the bottom there's a little sentiment that says for your kindness, and I thought that would work well with the big thanks cursive greeting. Now on my last card, I used the thanks dies that were included in that kit. This time I'm using the thanks stamp from that kit. They're both the same size, but I wanted to stamp this time just to keep the bulk off of this card. So I stamped thanks in black and then the for your kindness underneath that in black. Now I have a flap card created just like we did on the last example, and I'm gluing this panel right onto the front of that flap. I found it easier to do the stenciling and stamping on the flat panel and then add that to the folded panel, but you could do it however you want. Then I have another die cut that I'm gluing underneath that just to give the finished look and a place to write our personal greeting. Now I did decide to add a few gemstones to this. I always seem to do that. I just did some basic ones, nothing that was too distracting, but you could keep this a very smooth card if you wanted to. I hope these examples show how fun it is to take your dies, especially your layering dies, and use them to create stencils. And remember, you can always flip those die cut stencils over so you can get a mirror image. And remember, I first designed this card using the layered dies because that kind of made more sense, right? And then I used that as a guide to figure out how to do the stenciled version. All right, if you're interested in any of these supplies, I do link them below in my YouTube description as always, but go over to my website. I have so much more information, including photos of all of these cards that you can bookmark and refer to later. If you are interested in learning more about techniques like this, I will have 2 videos linked here at the end. I thank you for spending this time with me as always, and I hope you have a wonderful day.